I have told this story maybe 100 times now, to my daughter, to the ladies at my church, to a man on a train who did not ask for it but got it anyway. And every single time I get to the same part and my voice goes funny. So I am telling you now, slowly, the way it happened, because I was there and I saw it with my own two eyes and I still don't fully believe it. It was a Tuesday. I remember that because I had promised myself I would not cry on a Tuesday, and by the end of that afternoon I had broken that promise completely. Let me back up. I had saved for 2 years for that trip. 2 years of skipping the good coffee and mending my own coats instead of buying new ones. My husband, God rest him, had always wanted to see Marenholt. He used to talk about it the way some men talk about a football team. The old stone, the river, the guards outside Verrall Palace who stood so still that children would poke them just to see if they were real. He never got to go, so I went for the both of us. I brought a little photo of him in my coat pocket. I know how that sounds. I don't care. The morning was gray and soft. Not raining exactly, but the kind of air that leaves a fine mist on your glasses. You wipe them and they fog again. The whole city smelled of wet stone and coffee and something sweet from a cart down the lane. I bought a pastry I could not pronounce and ate it standing up, which my mother would have hated. By the time I reached the palace gates, it was late morning and the crowd had already gathered. You know the type. Tourists in bright jackets, a school group in matching caps, all shouting at once. A man with a camera so big it looked like he was carrying a small dog around his neck. And everywhere, that low hum of a lot of people trying to see the same thing. And there they were, the guards. I want you to understand something. I had seen photographs. Everyone has seen the photographs, but nothing prepares you for how still a real person can be. They stood in their long coats, dark as ink, with those tall caps that make even a short man look like he could touch the sky. They did not blink. They did not shift. One of them had a bead of the morning mist running down his cheek, right past his eye, and he did not so much as twitch. I stood watching him for a full minute, maybe more, thinking, how does a body do that? How do you turn a living man into a statue? I did not know yet that one of those statues was about to move faster than anything I have seen in my life. His name, I would learn later, was Corporal Rainer Vale, but that morning he was just a guard to me, tall, young, though it was hard to tell under the cap. There was something about the set of his jaw that made me pick him out from the others, not a hardness, more like a stillness that had a person inside it, if that makes sense. Some of the guards looked like they have gone somewhere else in their heads. This one looked like he was right there, present, watching everything without seeming to watch anything. A little girl near me was crying because she had dropped her ice cream. Her mother crouched down and made a joke about pigeons getting a treat, and the girl laughed through her tears the way children do, all wet and sudden. I remember that. I remember thinking what a nice ordinary morning it was. Then the tone of the crowd changed. You feel these things before you understand them. A ripple went through the people near the far gate. Heads turned. Phones came up. A murmur passed from mouth to mouth, growing louder, and someone near me said the word that made my heart lift like a girl's. The princess, the little princess, is coming. Now, I'm not one of those women who follows the royals. I could not tell you their birthdays or who wore what to which wedding, but even I knew about Princess Aveline. Everyone did. She was 7 years old and she had a gap in her front teeth and a laugh that had been on the front of every paper in Marenholt at least once. The kingdom loved her the way you love something small and bright that belongs to everyone and no one. She was the sort of child that made grown strangers smile without knowing why. And she was coming out. That was the word going round. There was some ceremony, a small one, and the family was arriving by motorcade, and if you stood at the right rail, you might catch a glimpse of her before she went inside. Well, you have never seen a crowd move like that. Polite people, mind you. Nobody shoved. But there was a great gentle surge toward the front, everyone rising on their toes, and I got carried along with it until I found myself pressed near the barrier, close enough to the gate that I could see the guards clearly, close enough to see Corporal Vale. The cars came into view down the long approach. There were 3 of them, dark, polished, the kind of shine that only comes from someone whose whole job is to make a car shine. They moved slow and stately along the drive, the way these things always do, with 2 men on foot walking beside the middle car. The crowd made a sound, a soft rising "oh," the way people do at fireworks before the big one goes up. I found the princess almost at once. She was in the middle car and someone had lowered the window a little, and there was her small face, and there was that gap-toothed grin, and she was waving. Not a royal wave, none of that stiff little turn of the wrist. A real child's wave, big and floppy and thrilled. She waved at all of us like we were her friends who had come to a party. I lifted my hand and waved back. So did 500 other people. And for one moment the whole gray morning went warm. I want to stop here for a second, because this is the part I always slow down on. Everything that came next happened in less time than it takes me to say this sentence. But in my memory it is long and slow, like something underwater. So bear with an old woman while I stretch it out. The 3 cars were maybe 30 feet from the inner gate. The princess was waving. The guard stood still. And then something went wrong with the middle car. I did not understand it at first. None of us did. There was a sound, a wrong sound, a sort of heavy mechanical bark from the engine that did not belong. The car lurched. Not much. Just a small, ugly jump forward, faster than it should have gone, and the 2 men walking beside it stumbled to keep pace, and one of them shouted something I could not hear. For half a second everyone laughed. I am ashamed to say it, but it is true. The crowd laughed, that nervous little laugh people do when they are not sure yet if something is a joke or not. A car jumping forward, a man tripping. It looked almost funny. Then the car did not slow down. It kept going, faster now, veering, and the sound of the engine climbed into a scream. And one of the men on foot was running now, actually running, and the laughter died in every throat at once. You could hear it die. 500 people going silent in the space of a breath is a sound of its own. Something had failed. I learned all the technical words later, and none of them matter now. What mattered then was that a heavy dark car was moving fast and wrong toward the inner gate, and it was not going to make the turn, and it was headed for the low stone wall beside the guard post, and the men who should have stopped it could not catch it. And the door of the middle car was not closed properly. In all the jostling of the drive, or the lurch, or God knows what, the rear door on the crowd side had come open. Just a hand's width. Just enough. I saw the princess's face change. That is the thing I cannot get out of my head, even now. That little face going from joy to confusion to something no 7-year-old's face should hold. The car was moving and jerking, and the door was swinging, and she was being thrown against her belt, and her small hands came up, and her grin was gone, replaced by the wide blank shock of a child who does not yet know to be afraid but is about to learn. People started to scream. I want to be honest with you about what I did. I did nothing. I froze. My hand was still half raised from waving, and it just stayed there useless, while my whole body forgot how to work. That is what most of us did. We are not built for these moments. We think we would run in, we think we would be heroes, but the truth is that most of us turn to stone at the exact moment stone is no use. But not all of us. I told you Corporal Vale had been standing still, stiller than the others, so still that the mist ran down his face and he did not move. He moved now. I did not even see him decide. There was no wind-up, no pause, no dramatic turn of the head. One instant he was a statue in a long dark coat. The next he was gone from his post, and I mean gone, off that spot like something released from a spring, and my old eyes could barely track him. He did not run the way people run. He ran the way water goes downhill. Fast and certain, and without a single wasted step. The car was coming around now, sliding, its back end swinging out toward the crowd side, toward that open door, and the princess was half out of her seat because the belt had done something or come loose. I never learned exactly. and for one horrible instant her small body was tilting toward that gap in the door with nothing to hold her. Somebody near me screamed a single word, "No," and Corporal Vale left his feet. I have watched men dive in films. You have too. It always looks like something. There is music, there is slow motion, there is a camera that knows just where to be. This was nothing like that. This was ugly and real and terrifying. A young man in a heavy coat threw his whole body through the air, sideways, low, arms out, straight into the path of a moving car, toward a door that was swinging like a trap. And there was no music. There was only the scream of the engine and 500 people making a sound I hope I never hear again. He got there. I do not know how. I have gone over it 1,000 times and I still do not know how a person covers that much ground that fast. But he got there, and his arms went around that small tilting body, and he pulled her in, pulled her against his chest and turned his own back to the door, to the wall, to whatever was coming, so that his body was between the princess and all of it. And then the car hit the wall. The sound was enormous, a great flat crunch of metal and stone that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. The car folded against the low wall and stopped, all at once, the way a fast thing stops when it meets something that will not move. Glass went everywhere, a bright hard rain of it, sparkling in the gray light. A piece of the wall broke loose and tumbled. And in the middle of it, curled on the ground just past the wreck, was Corporal Vale, on his back, with Princess Aveline held tight against his chest, and his arms wrapped completely around her small dark head so that not one shard, not one splinter, not one bit of the whole terrible thing could reach her. For a moment nobody moved. The whole crowd, the whole morning, the whole world held still. Then the princess started to cry. And oh, what a beautiful sound that was, because a child who is crying is a child who is alive. She wailed, that full-throated furious wail of a frightened little girl, and it was the best sound I have ever heard, and half the crowd burst into tears at the sound of it, myself included, my hand still stupidly half raised in a wave that had started a lifetime ago. The other guards were moving now, the men from the motorcade, people in dark suits appearing from everywhere the way they do. There was shouting and running and the sharp, clean sound of orders being given. But my eyes stayed on the young man on the ground, on Corporal Vale, who had not gotten up. He had not gotten up. He lay there with the crying child on his chest, and his arms were still wrapped around her, and I could see now that his coat was torn and there was blood, dark and terrible, coming from somewhere on his side or his shoulder, spreading into the wet stone beneath him. He had turned his back to the crash. He had put his own body between a 7-year-old and a wall, and the wall had won that argument against his body, and he had not let go of her, even hurt, even bleeding on the ground. He had not let go. A woman in a pale coat came out of the second car at a dead run, and I knew at once she was the mother, the way you always know a mother, and she dropped to her knees beside them with a sound that had no words in it at all. And Corporal Vale, this young man who could barely move, this young man leaking his own blood onto the palace stones, did the thing that finished me completely. He did not hand the princess over. Not yet. He turned his head just an inch and he looked at the little girl crying on his chest, and I was close enough to see his lips move. I could not hear him over the crowd, but I have thought about it every day since, and I would put my life on what he said, because his face said it, even if I could not hear it. He told her she was safe. That was the first thing, before his own pain, before his own blood, before anything. This bleeding boy on the ground turned to a terrified child and told her she was safe. And only when her wailing had softened, only when her small hands had loosened their grip on his torn coat, only then did he let her mother take her, gently, so gently, lifting her away. And then, and only then, did Corporal Rainer Vale close his eyes and let his head fall back against the cold, wet stone. The crowd around me was in pieces. Grown men were weeping. The school group had gone silent, all those children in their matching caps just staring, and their teacher had her hands over her mouth. Somebody was praying out loud. Somebody else was shouting for a doctor over and over, though there were already people rushing in with a red bag, and I let myself believe that meant help had come. I stood there with my glasses fogged over from my own crying and my late husband's photograph in my pocket, and I thought, he would not believe this. He came to see the guards who stand still, and I have seen the guard who moved. They put up screens after that. Big dark ones, wheeled and fast, to give the family and the injured man some privacy and to keep the phones away. The crowd was gently pushed back. The nice ordinary morning was well and truly over. But before the screens closed, I saw one more thing. The princess, safe now in her mother's arms, twisted around to look back. Her little face was red and wet and swollen from crying, and she looked back at the young man on the ground, the man who had leapt, and she reached out one small hand toward him over her mother's shoulder. She did not want to leave him. A 7-year-old child who had known that man for perhaps 40 seconds, who had been held by him for one terrible moment between joy and horror, did not want to be taken away from him. And that, I think, tells you everything about what happened in those 40 seconds that no report or newspaper ever could. Then the screens closed, and I could not see him anymore. I stood in that crowd for a long time, longer than made sense. The people thinned out around me, drifting away in shocked little clumps, talking in low voices, some of them holding each other. A young man offered me his arm because I suppose I looked unsteady, and I let him walk me to a bench, and we sat, two strangers, and neither of us said a word for a good while. Finally he said, "Do you think he'll be all right?" And I said, "I don't know." Because I didn't. That is the honest truth of it. I had seen the blood. I had seen his eyes close. I had seen a young man give everything he had in the space of a breath without 1 second of hesitation, for a child he was sworn to protect but did not know, and I did not know if it had cost him his life. I did not sleep that night. I sat up in my little rented room with the window open to the sound of the river, and I held my husband's photograph and I told him everything, every second of it, the mist on the guard's cheek, the princess's floppy wave, the wrong sound of the engine, the scream of the crowd, the leap, the blood, the small hand reaching back. "You would not have believed it," I told him. "You came all this way in your dreams to see men who stand still, and I saw one fly." Outside, the city that loved a gap-toothed little girl did not yet know how close it had come to losing her. But by morning, it would know. And by morning, everyone in Marenholt would want to know the name of the guard who leapt. I already knew it. Corporal Rainer Vale. And I did not yet know if he was alive. The next morning, the whole of Marenholt woke up different. I know that sounds like something a person says to make a story bigger than it was, but it is true, and I felt it the moment I stepped out of my little rented room. The city had a hush over it. Not a silence, exactly. The trams still ran, the coffee carts still steamed, the pigeons still fought over crumbs in the square. But underneath all of it there was a quiet, the kind a house gets when someone in it is very ill and everyone is waiting to hear. Every newsstand had the same face on it. Not the princess. That surprised me. I had expected her little gap-toothed grin plastered across everything. But no. The papers had all made the same choice, every single one of them, and it was a photograph of a young man in a dark coat and a tall cap, standing at his post, staring straight ahead. Somebody had dug up an old picture of him on duty from before, when he was just one guard among many. And above it, in letters as big as my hand, the same words over and over. The guard who leapt. I bought a paper. I could not read the language well, only bits, but I did not need to. I stood on the corner and looked at that young man's face, and my eyes filled up all over again. A woman next to me was doing the same. We looked at each other and neither of us said anything, but she reached out and squeezed my arm, and I squeezed hers back, two strangers who had both been changed by a boy neither of us knew. The first thing everyone wanted to know was the same thing I had lain awake wanting to know. Was he alive? The palace had said very little at first. There had been a short statement late the night before, the careful kind, the kind that tells you a serious thing has happened without telling you how serious. The princess was safe and unharmed. A member of the guard had been injured. He was receiving care. The kingdom's thoughts were with him and his family. His family. That was the word that undid people, because it made him real. Not a statue, not a symbol, not a photograph on a newsstand. A young man with a mother somewhere, a mother who had gotten a knock on her door the night before, the way mothers do, and had heard the worst words a mother can hear. That he was hurt, that it was bad, that she should come. I found out all of this slowly, over the days that followed, from the papers and from the talk on the street, and from the woman who ran the little cafe where I took my breakfast. Her name was Marta, and she had a son of her own who had wanted to be a guard once, and she talked to me every morning while I ate, in her broken version of my language and my broken version of hers. And between us, we understood everything that mattered. This is what I learned about Corporal Rainer Vale. He was 24 years old. He was not from the capital at all. He came from a small town up in the northern hills, a place of sheep and stone and hard winters, the sort of town that most people in the city could not have found on a map. His father had died when he was young, a farm accident. He was the oldest of four, and after his father was gone, he had more or less raised the other three while his mother worked 2 jobs to keep the roof over them. People in his town said he had always been like that, steady, the one who caught things before they fell. There was a story going round, and I do not know if it was true, but I choose to believe it, that when he was 14 his little sister had wandered onto the ice of a frozen pond and it had cracked, and Rainer had gone out flat on his belly, spreading his weight, and pulled her back by her coat, and never once told their mother because he did not want to frighten her. He had joined the guard at 19, not because he loved kings and palaces. His town did not much care about such things. He joined because it was steady work with good pay, and he sent almost all of it home. Marta told me this with tears standing in her eyes, wiping the same clean spot on the counter over and over the way people do when their hands need something to do. He sent it home. That boy stood still in the cold for hours, so that his mother would not have to work 2 jobs anymore. And when a car came loose, and a little girl tilted toward an open door, that same boy did the only thing his whole life had ever taught him to do. He caught the thing before it fell. The city could not get enough of him. By the second day there were flowers at the palace gates. Not a few, thousands. A great drift of them growing by the hour, roses and lilies and cheap little bunches from corner shops and wildflowers that children had clearly picked themselves. People left notes. They left drawings. One little boy left his own toy soldier, a small painted guard in a tall cap, propped up against the gate, and someone had taken a photograph of it, and it was in all the papers too. And I am not ashamed to tell you it made me cry harder than almost anything. I went to the gates myself on the second day. I had to. I could not stay away. I brought a single white rose, which was all my budget would stretch to, and I laid it down at the edge of that enormous sea of flowers, and I stood there in the crowd of quiet people, and I said a small prayer for a young man I had watched fly through the air a day and a half before. While I was standing there, something happened that I will never forget. The gate opened. Not all the way, just enough for a small group to come out. Palace people in dark coats, and among them a woman I recognized at once even though I had only seen her for one screaming moment the day before. The mother, the princess's mother. She came out to the gates on foot with no announcement, and she began to walk along the barrier looking at the flowers, and the crowd went utterly silent. She stopped now and then to read a note. Once she pressed her hand to her mouth, and when she reached the place where the little boy's toy soldier stood propped against the gate, she crouched down, right there on the wet stone in her fine pale coat, and she picked it up, and she held it to her chest, and she stayed like that for a long moment with her eyes closed. Then she stood, and she turned to the crowd and she spoke. I could not understand all of it, but I understood enough, and Marta filled in the rest for me later. She thanked us for coming. She said her daughter was safe and well, that Aveline had slept in her own bed the night before, that she had asked 100 questions and eaten a good breakfast, and was, in the way of small children, already more or less herself again. And then her voice broke, and she said the thing that the whole kingdom was waiting to hear. She said that Corporal Vale was alive. The sound that went through that crowd, I cannot describe it. It was not a cheer. It was too full of tears to be a cheer. It was more like a great single breath, 5,000 people exhaling at once, a sob and a laugh and a prayer all tangled together. The woman next to me grabbed my hand. A man behind me sat down heavily on the ground and put his face in his hands. Alive. He was alive. But the mother was not finished, and the way her face changed told us the rest was not all good. He was alive, she said, but he was badly hurt. She did not give the details, and I was glad of it because the details were his and not ours, but she said enough. There had been surgery through the night. There would be more. His back had taken the worst of it, and there were questions, hard questions, that even the doctors could not yet answer, about whether he would walk the same, about whether he would stand a post again, about whether the strong, steady body that had thrown itself through the air would ever be quite that body again. He had turned his back to the crash, you see, to shield her. Everything that should have hit a 7-year-old had hit him instead, and it had hit him in the place a body can least afford to be hit. The mother stood at those gates, and she said, in a voice that shook, that her family owed him a debt that could never be repaid, that there was no honor, no reward, no title in all of Marenholt that could balance what that young man had given, and that she and the king would spend the rest of their lives making sure he never wanted for anything again. Then she did one more thing. She still had the little boy's toy soldier in her hand, and instead of setting it back down, she looked out at the crowd and asked, gently, whose it was. And after a moment a small figure was lifted up at the front of the barrier, a boy of maybe 5, red-faced and shy, hiding against his mother's leg. She walked over to him. She crouched down again, and she asked him would he mind terribly if she kept his soldier to give to the real one when he was well enough, to let him know that even the smallest people in the kingdom were thinking of him. The little boy nodded. He could not even speak. He just nodded with his eyes as big as saucers, and the mother of a princess kissed the top of his head and thanked him as though he had given her a crown. I tell you, there was not a dry eye at that gate, not one. The days that followed were strange ones. I had only meant to stay in Marenholt for a week, but I found I could not make myself leave. I told myself it was the sights I had not seen yet, the museums, the river walk. But the truth was simpler than that. I wanted to know how the story ended. I had watched the beginning of it with my own eyes, and something in me could not go home until I knew. So I stayed, and I watched the kingdom watch over one of its own. The flowers kept coming. The notes kept coming. Somebody started a book of messages, a great leather book at a table by the gate, and the line to sign it stretched around the block, and people stood in the rain to wait their turn. I signed it myself. I wrote in my own language because it was the only way I could say it true. I saw what you did. I will tell everyone for the rest of my life. Thank you. The papers began to fill in more of who he was. His fellow guards spoke about him, carefully. The way soldiers do. They said he was quiet. They said he never complained about the cold or the long hours. They said that on the worst days, the freezing ones, when even the toughest of them were counting the minutes, Rainer Vale would stand his post like it was a warm summer afternoon, and it steadied the rest of them just to have him there. One of them told a story that stuck with me. He said that a few months back, a tourist had fainted in the heat, right in front of the post, an older man who had gone down hard on the stone. And that guards are trained not to break their posture, not for anything. That is the whole discipline of the thing. But Rainer had broken it. He had left his post to catch the man's head before it hit the ground, and taken the reprimand for it afterward without a word of argument, because as far as he was concerned, there had never been a choice to make. That was the kind of man he was. The kind who understood, all the way down in his bones, that the still watching was only ever in service of the sudden moving, that the whole point of standing so perfectly still was to be ready, at any second, to do exactly what he did. I thought a great deal in those days about that little girl, because a thing had passed between them in those 40 seconds that I did not think either of them would ever fully let go of. I kept remembering her small hand reaching back over her mother's shoulder. A child does not do that for a stranger. Somewhere in the terror of that moment, held tight against a bleeding man's chest while the world came apart, she had understood something. That this person had her. That whatever else was true, she was not going to be let go. And the papers, a few days in, gave me a small piece of news that made me put my hand over my heart. The princess had asked to see him. She had asked every day, apparently. Where is the guard? Is the guard all right? When can I see the guard? She did not know his name at first, only that he was the one who had held her, and she called him my guard, and nobody could talk her out of it. My guard. As though he belonged to her now, and I suppose in some way he did. They had not let her, of course. He was too ill, and a hospital is no place for a small child, and there was nothing there she needed to see. But she had drawn him a picture. Every child in that story seems to have drawn a picture, and every one of them broke my heart. Hers was of a tall man in a dark coat with a little girl on his shoulders, both of them smiling, and a son in the corner, the way children always put a son in the corner. And underneath, in the wobbly, careful letters of a 7-year-old just learning to write, she had put 4 words. Thank you, my guard. They took it to him. He was awake by then, in and out, the surgeries mostly behind him, but the hard road of getting better still all ahead. And they told me, though I do not know how anyone could know such a private thing, that when they gave him that drawing, this quiet, strong young man from the northern hills who had never once complained about anything, held it in his hands and wept. Not for himself, not for his back or his post or the body that might never be quite the same. He wept for the 4 wobbly words of a little girl who was alive to write them. I sat in M.A.R.T.A.S. cafe the morning I read that, and I could not finish my coffee. M.A.R.T.A. came round the counter and sat with me and did not say anything, just sat, the way the good ones do. He is going to live, I said to her. It was half a question. He is going to live, she said. And then, because she was a mother and mothers see the whole shape of a thing, she added quietly, but living is not the end of it. Now comes the hard part. Now he has to find out who he is when he cannot be who he was. I did not fully understand her then. I would later. Because there is a difference, you see, between surviving a thing and healing from it. Rainer Vale had survived. The whole kingdom had held its breath, and he had come through the worst of it and lived. But a man who has given his body for someone else does not simply get up one day and walk back into his old life as though nothing has changed. There is a long road after the leap. A road the newspapers do not follow, because there are no dramatic pictures on it, only the slow, hard work of a young man learning to stand again. And there was a question hanging over all of it, the one his fellow guards would not say out loud and the papers only hinted at. The question of what a guard is when he can no longer guard, of what you do with a life that was built entirely around standing watch, when standing itself has become the thing you are fighting to do. I stayed in Marienholt. I told myself one more week, just to see him get a little better, just to see the flowers thin out and the city breathe easy again, just to know, for certain, with my own eyes if I could manage it, that the boy who flew was going to be all right. I did not yet know that before I left that kingdom, I would see Corporal Rainer Vale one more time. And I did not yet know that when I did, it would be the most extraordinary moment of the whole extraordinary thing. Autumn came to Marienholt while I was still there. I had told myself one more week so many times that the weeks had turned into a season. The leaves along the river went gold and then brown. The mornings got a bite in them. I mended the same coat I had brought from home 3 times over, and at the cafe stopped charging me for my second coffee, and I became, without ever quite deciding to, a person who lived in that city. My daughter rang me and asked when I was coming back, and I said soon, soon, and I meant it, but I did not go. I could not go, not yet. The story was not finished, and I had been there for the start of it, and something in me needed to see the end. The city healed slowly. The flowers at the gate were cleared away at last gently, and the great leather book of messages was taken inside to be kept. The papers moved on to other things, the way papers do. But Rainer Vale was not forgotten. Not for one day. His face had gone into the kingdom the way a face does when it stands for something, and people still spoke of him in the cafes and on the trams, still asked after him, still wanted to know. And what they wanted to know, more and more as the weeks went by, was whether he would ever stand again. The news came out in pieces. He had left the hospital. That was a good day. I remember the whole cafe cheering when Marta read it out. He had gone to a place where they teach broken bodies to work again, one of those quiet, hard places full of parallel bars and patient people. And there, away from the cameras, the boy who had flown through the air was learning to do the hardest thing he had ever done, which was to put one foot in front of the other. It was bad for a while. I will not pretend it was not. There were reports, careful ones, that spoke of setbacks. That first hopeful talk of him standing a post again quietly faded from the papers, and its absence said more than any headline could have. A man does not turn his back to a crashing car and walk away whole. He had known that when he leapt. That, I think, is the part people do not sit with long enough. He had known, in whatever fraction of a second he had to decide, that his body might pay for it forever. And he had leapt anyway. There is a word for that. It is not bravery quite. Bravery is doing the frightening thing. This was something more. This was a man who, offered the choice between his own future and a child's life, did not experience it as a choice at all. Who was built, all the way down, so that the leap was simply what a body did. I thought about that a great deal through that gold and brown autumn. I thought about his father, dead on a farm. I thought about his sister on the ice. I thought about all the years of catching things before they fell, until catching had become not a thing he did but a thing he was. And I wondered what happens to a man like that when the catching is done, and it is his turn to be caught. The answer, when it came, was the thing that finished me completely. Because here is what the kingdom did. They did not quietly retire him with a medal and a pension and a handshake. They did not let him fade back into the northern hills to be a story people used to tell. The king himself, they said, would not hear of it. And so, as Rainer Vale slowly, painfully, stubbornly relearned how to walk, the palace built something for him to walk toward. There is a role, an old one going back centuries in Marenholt, that had fallen mostly out of use. A guard too old or too injured for the post, but too valued to lose, could be made a keeper. Not a man who stands the watch, but a man who trains those who do, who teaches the young ones how to be still, who carries the whole meaning of the thing forward from one generation to the next. So that every guard who ever stands outside Verrill Palace stands a little straighter because of what he passed down. They offered it to Raina Vale. They offered the boy who could no longer stand a post the honor of teaching every future guard how to stand one. I read me that news and had to stop halfway through because she was crying too hard to go on, and I took the paper from her and finished it myself. And then I could not read either, and the two of us sat in her little cafe and wept over a young man neither of us had ever properly met. And an old woman at the next table who did not know why we were crying started crying too, just from the sight of us. And that is the kind of thing Raina Vale did to people without even being in the room. He accepted, of course he accepted. What else would a man like that do? And so, as the first cold of winter came down off the hills, Corporal Raina Vale, walking with a cane, walking slowly, walking at all, went back to Verrill Palace. Not to stand at the gate, but to walk its grounds and to teach. I saw him. This is the part I have been getting to. This is the last thing and the best thing, and the thing I told you at the start would make my voice go funny. It is going funny now. Let me get it out. It was near the end of my time in Marenhold. Truly the end this time. I had a ticket home. I had promised my daughter I was going. And on one of my last mornings I walked down to the palace one final time, to stand where I had stood on that gray Tuesday months before, and to say a kind of goodbye to the whole strange chapter of my life that had happened there. The gate was ordinary again. Guards at their posts, still as statues, mist on their caps, tourists with their big cameras, a school group in matching hats. Life had gone back to itself the way it does, the way it should. And then there was a small stir in the crowd, that same ripple I had felt all those months ago, and my old heart clenched because I knew that ripple. I knew what it meant. A small figure had come out through a side gate, with a woman beside her and a few dark coats around them, and she was walking along inside the barrier, and she had a gap in her front teeth, and she was waving that big floppy waving that no palace has ever managed to train out of her. Princess Aveline, bigger than I remembered. Children change fast at that age, but the same, alive, waving. And walking slowly beside her, with a cane, in a long dark coat that was not quite a guard's coat anymore, but not quite anything else either, was a young man I would have known anywhere. Would have known in the dark. Would have known from the set of his jaw and the stillness that had a person inside it, even now, even leaning on a cane. Corporal Raina Vale, the guard who leapt. I put my hand over my mouth. I could not help it. Around me, people were realizing who they were seeing, and the same soft sound was going through the crowd that had gone through it at the gates all those months before, that sob and laugh and prayer sound, and I was making it too. He walked slowly. Every step was clearly work, but he walked, and the little girl walked beside him, matching her pace to his without seeming to think about it, the way a child does when she loves someone, slowing herself down so he would not have to hurry. And every few steps she would look up at him and say something, and he would look down at her and say something back. And once she laughed, that gap-toothed laugh that had been on the front of every paper in the kingdom, and he smiled. And I tell you, the whole gray morning went warm again, exactly the way it had before. They stopped not far from where I stood, and the princess did a thing that I will carry with me until the day I go to join my husband. She reached up and took the young man's free hand, not because she needed it. She was steady on her feet, she was well, she was 7 and full of life. She took his hand because she wanted to, and the two of them stood there for a moment, the little girl who had been saved and the young man who had saved her, hand in hand at the palace gate, in front of the whole quiet weeping crowd. And then she noticed the flowers. Someone in the crowd had brought flowers. Old habit maybe, or maybe they had known she might come. And the princess, spotting them, tugged on the young man's hand and pointed and said something, and he nodded, and the two of them came slowly toward the barrier. Toward me. I want to be clear that I do not think she saw me. Why would she? I was one old woman among hundreds, but she came to the barrier a few feet from where I stood, close enough that I could see her face, close enough that I could see his, and I could see that he had grown thinner and there were lines around his eyes that a 24-year-old should not have, the kind of lines that pain draws on a young face. But I could also see that his eyes were the same, steady, present, right there. The little girl took the flowers that were offered to her over the barrier, a small posy, and she thanked the person who gave them, and then she did not keep them. She turned, and she held them up to the young man beside her, this little girl offering flowers to her guard, and she said something, and though I could not hear it, I did not need to, because I had learned by then to read the shape of the important things. She thanked him. Again, still, after all those months, this child, safe and whole and growing, had not let go of what he had done any more than he had let go of her that day on the stones. She looked up at the young man with the cane, and she thanked him with a fistful of flowers, and he took them, and he crouched down slowly, painfully, all the way down to her height, which must have cost him something to do, and he said something back to her, close and quiet just for her. And whatever he said, she threw her arms around his neck. Right there, in front of everyone. A princess of Marenholt wrapped her arms around a broken guard's neck and held on, and he held her, gently, one arm around her small back and the other braced on his cane, and neither of them was in any hurry to let go. The crowd made no sound at all, not one. Even the children were silent. It was the kind of moment where a whole crowd of strangers somehow agrees, without a word, that the best thing they can do is be quiet and let it happen. I stood there with the tears running down into the collar of my thrice-mended coat, and I reached into my pocket and I held my husband's photograph, and I turned it so that he could see. I know how that sounds. I did it anyway. "Look," I whispered to him. "Look, he's all right, the one who flew, he's all right." They straightened up after a while, the guard and the girl, and they went on with their slow walk, hand in hand, back toward the side gate, and the crowd began at last to breathe and murmur and wipe its eyes. And just before they reached the gate, the little girl turned around one more time, exactly as she had done that first terrible day, and she looked back at the crowd, at all of us, and she waved. That big floppy child's wave. And this time it was not a wave of hello or a wave of goodbye. It was something else. It was, I think, a wave that said, "Look what we did, all of us together. Look, he's still here." Then they were gone, and the gate closed, and it was just an ordinary morning at an ordinary palace again, with guards standing still and mist on their caps and tourists lifting their cameras. Except that one of those still guards, I noticed, one of the young ones at the near post, was standing just a little straighter than the rest, just a little more carefully, and I understood all at once that this was the thing Raina Vale would go on doing now for the rest of his life, not standing the post himself, but teaching every young man who did to stand it the way he had, to understand all the way down that the still watching is only ever in service of the sudden moving. That you stand perfectly still so that you are ready, at any second, to do the one thing that matters. I went home the next week. I am home now as I tell you this. My daughter says I am different since the trip, and she is right, though I could never fully explain to her how. I brought back no souvenirs, no little snow globe of the palace, no tea towel with the guards on it. I brought back only this story, which I have told 100 times now and will tell 100 more until my own voice gives out. Because my husband saved for years to see the guards who stand still, he never made it. He died wanting to see men who do not move. And I went in his place, and I saw the one who moved. I saw a boy from the northern hills, who caught his sister on the ice and never told his mother, who sent his wages home so she would not have to work 2 jobs, who stood in the cold so that others would not fall. I saw him turn his back to a crashing car for a child he had known for 40 seconds. I saw him bleed on the palace stones and tell her she was safe before he let himself feel his own pain. I saw a whole kingdom hold its breath for him, and I saw him come back, on a cane slowly, to teach the next ones how to stand. People ask me when I finish telling it what the lesson is, as if a thing like that needs a lesson stitched onto the end of it. But I have thought about it, and I do have an answer, and I will give it to you now, and then I will let you go. We spend so much of our lives standing still, waiting, watching, doing our small, ordinary duties in the cold, thinking that the stillness is all there is, thinking that nobody sees, thinking that it does not matter. But the stillness is not the point. The stillness is only ever getting you ready. And one day, if you are the sort of person who has spent your whole quiet life catching things before they fall, the moment will come, fast, with no warning, with no time to think. And what you do in that one moment will be nothing more and nothing less than the sum of every still, cold, ordinary day that came before it. Corporal Rainer Vale stood still for years, so that he would be ready to move for 1 second. And when the second came, he flew. That is the whole of it. That is what I saw with my own 2 eyes on a gray Tuesday in Marenholt, when I had promised myself I would not cry. I broke that promise. I have never once been sorry.